Tonight, we are going to slow down together and wander quietly through a life that is long gone. It was a life with a great deal of quiet in it, more quiet than anything else. That is the part that is almost never told. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. It is gently comforting to know who else is awake tonight. You do not need to know anything about history to listen. There will be no dates to remember and nothing to keep track of. You only need to be here. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive. Let us begin. Many years ago, on a low gray coast in the north of Europe, there was a country of flat fields and slow rivers. It was a country of very old towns. The winters there were heavy. The light came late in the morning. It left early in the afternoon. For months at a time, the sky sat close over the rooftops like a lid. A girl was born in that country in the middle years of a century that is now very far behind us. She was born into a palace. That happens to a very small number of people. It changes almost nothing about how the evenings feel. The evenings there felt cold. They felt long. We are not going to follow her through the great events of her life tonight. Those are written down elsewhere, in books, for people who are awake. Tonight, we are only going to visit the calm hours. There were a great many of them. Consider what a life actually is when you lay it out slowly. It is mostly waiting. It is mostly evenings. It is mostly the same rooms seen again and again in different weather. The dramatic parts are very short. They take up almost no room at all in the actual hours of a person. The rest is quiet. She spent her childhood under a northern sky, and later she crossed an ocean and spent some years under a southern one. Two shores very far apart, and the same person standing under both of them. Here is the small thing that this whole night rests on. The stars over those two shores were not entirely the same, but many of them were. You can travel a very long way across the surface of the world. Then you look up. A great deal of what is above you has come with you. That is a strange comfort. It is also true. There is an old habit among people who live far from where they began. They go outside at night. They look for something familiar overhead. Sailors did it. Travelers on distant roads did it. People carried away from home by circumstance did it. Over and over, for since there have been people. And what they found was usually the same. Some of the sky had changed. Most of it had not. Picture the low coast in the north first. Picture a garden in winter, held inside stone walls. The gravel paths are raked into straight lines. The hedges are cut square. The fountains are shut off until spring. Picture the great glass houses at the edge of that garden. They were warm inside, breathing a slow fog onto their own panes. They kept palms and orange trees alive through a season that would otherwise have ended them. At the end of the day, someone walked out along those gravel paths with a taper. He lit the lamps beside them, one at a time. The lamps were not bright. They were never meant to be bright. They were meant to show you where the path was, yeah? So you would not step into the hedge in the dark. That is all most light has ever been for. Not to fill a place up, only to show you the edge of the next few steps. The girl would have watched this from a window. Children do watch that sort of thing from windows in the hour before they are called in. She would have seen the small moving flame go out along the path and stop, and the little glow arrive, and the flame move on. It is a slow thing to watch. It is a very good thing to watch when you are small and there is nothing else you are required to do. The lamps came on one after another. The garden filled in gently, in pieces, from the house outward. And then it was evening, and the person with the taper went back inside, and the paths glowed faintly all night for nobody in particular. Now picture the other shore. Picture a high place in a wide valley, very far south and very west, with two great mountains standing at the eastern edge of it. Both of them were old. Both had snow on the top all year, even where the air below was warm. The valley, held a city. The city held a great many small fires at night, lamps and candles and kitchen stoves. The little braziers of people selling food in the street after dark. From the high place, at the right hour, you could see all of them at once, not clearly, just as a low scattered field of light lying across the floor of the valley. It looked from up there very much like the sky. That is not a poetic invention. It is simply what a city looks like from above at night. People have remarked on it for as long as there have been cities and hills to stand on. She stood on a terrace up there in the years when she lived in that valley and looked down at those lights. And on some of those nights, she would have turned around and looked up instead. Here is where the two shores meet. Much of that southern sky was new to her. There were shapes down near the horizon that had never been visible from the northern coast at all. But overhead, high up, a great deal of it was exactly what it had always been. The same handful of bright ones, the same wide pale band across the middle of the night. Every people on earth has given it a name, usually a name involving milk or a road or a river. She had learned those from a northern garden. They were there over a southern valley. This is the thing that travelers have always found, and it has always steadied them a little. The ground under you can change completely. The language in the street can change completely. The food, the heat, the smell of the air, the hour when people eat, all of it can change. And then the night comes, and a large part of the sky is unchanged. It is not that the sky is comforting because it is beautiful. It is comforting because it is old and it does not adjust itself to you. It was there before you arrived. It will be there after you have gone somewhere else. It does not need anything from you at all. Consider how long those particular lights have been doing this. The people who built the two mountains into their stories were looking at the same overhead sky. The people who laid the first straight roads across the northern fields were looking at it too. Every person carried far from home has done this. They went outside in that first strange year. They looked up and found something they recognized. That has happened more times than anyone could count. It is happening tonight. There is something worth saying about the glass houses in that northern garden. They were kept warm all winter by hand. That took work, and the work went on at night. Somewhere under those long glass roofs, there were stoves and flues running beneath the floor, and a person whose job was to keep the heat steady while everyone else was asleep. He would have come out in the cold and gone down the low steps and opened the iron door and looked at the fire. Then he added fuel. Then he closed the door. Then he waited and looked at nothing much, and after a while he checked it again. That is the whole of it. It is not a story. That was the entire night. Outside, frost on the panes. Inside, orange trees from a warm country, standing in pots in the dark, alive on the strength of somebody sitting up with a stove. Nobody thanked him for that. It does not work that way. Nobody usually does. The trees did not know. The house did not notice. The heat simply held hour after hour, and in the morning, nothing had been lost. That is what most of the care in the world looks like. It looks like nothing having gone wrong. Consider how much of that has happened over the centuries. Fires kept in through the night so that something delicate would still be there at dawn. It is not a difficult job. It is only a long one. It is being done tonight, somewhere in some form. Let us stay with the terrace a moment longer. The stone would have been warm. Stone in a high valley takes the whole day of sun into itself. It gives that heat back slowly through the evening. A wall can be warm to the hand hours after the sun has gone. Below, the small lights of the city, above the old ones. And between them, on the terrace, a person standing still and not doing anything in particular, which is what people mostly do on terraces at night. Down in the valley, at that hour, the city was putting itself to bed in the ordinary way. Shutters were being pulled closed on the upper floors. Somebody was carrying a chair in off a doorstep. The women who sold food in the street were banking down their braziers, letting the coals go gray under the ash so they would hold a little heat in the morning. Water ran in the stone channels. It ran all night because there was no reason to stop it and no way to stop it anyway. A dog somewhere deciding whether to bark and then deciding not to. None of this was remarkable. It is not the sort of thing that gets written down. It is only what a city does every single evening, in every century, in every part of the world. when the light goes. And it went on doing it, whether anyone stood on the terrace and watched or not. That is worth resting on for a moment. You do not have to hold on to it. The evening did not need a witness. We are going to spend this night in rooms like that one. Not in the events, in the rooms. In gardens with the fountains turned off for the winter. In a ship's cabin with a lamp swinging on its hook. In a walled garden in a warm town where the water runs all night through stone channels because nobody has any reason to turn it off. In corridors, in courtyards, on terraces, beside fires. Those are the places where a life is actually spent, and they are almost never written down because nothing happens in them. That is exactly why they are good for tonight. The great events of that life were short, and they are finished. They finished a very long time ago. The evenings were long. The evenings were most of it. The sky she watched from a cold northern garden was the same sky she watched from a warm southern terrace, and it is in large part the same sky over your roof right now, whatever hour it is where you are. That sky has not been tending to anyone. It has simply been there. The world was turning then. It is turning now. It does not require your attention to keep doing it. Let us wander somewhere else now. The palace where she grew up was not a warm place. It was large. It was stone. It had corridors that went on for a great many years before arriving at anything. A child in a place like that learns something early. She learns the sound of her own footsteps in an empty hall. She learns the way a door sounds when it closes 3 rooms away. She learns how long it takes for quiet to come back after a noise. It does not take long. Quiet always comes back. The rooms were tall. The ceilings were very far above the furniture, and there was a great deal of air between the tops of the wardrobes and the plaster overhead. That air was cold in winter. Heat stayed low. The fires in the fireplaces did their best. They could only warm the part of the room that was near them. The rest remained cool and still. You do not notice this as a child if you have never lived anywhere else. Cold rooms are simply rooms. Long corridors are simply the way you get from one place to another. It is only later, when you have seen other kinds of houses, that you understand the one you grew up in was unusual. She did not understand that yet. The palace was the whole world, and the world was large and stone and quiet, and that was simply how things were. Consider the evenings there. In winter, the light left early. By the middle of the afternoon, the windows had gone on gray, and by the hour, the lamps were lit. The garden outside had disappeared entirely. The lamps were oil. They were carried in by servants, one at a time, into each room that was being used that evening. There is a particular feeling to a room that has just had a lamp brought into it. The walls change color. The shadows rearrange themselves. The furniture which had been going slowly shapeless in the dimness, comes back. It is not a dramatic thing. It is a very quiet thing, but it changes the room completely. She would have been reading, perhaps, or sitting with a governess, or doing some small prescribed task that filled the hour before supper. The lamp arrived, and the room shifted around her, and the evening began. That is how evenings began for a very long time, in a great many houses, before anyone had thought of a switch on the wall. Someone carried the light in. The light did not come by itself. There is something in that worth keeping. The person who brought the lamp had been doing it all afternoon. Room by room, through the stone building. He would do it again tomorrow. He had done it yesterday. It was not a job anyone talked about. It was simply a thing that happened every day, the way water happens when you turn a tap, except that there was a person inside the happening, and the person had cold hands and a taper and a route through the building that never changed. The route went from the kitchens up the back stair, then along the east corridor, then into the library first, because the library had the most windows and went dark the fastest. Then the sitting rooms, then the smaller parlors, then the hallways where the lamps sat in brackets on the walls and had to be reached with a step. By the time the last lamp was lit, the first one had been burning for nearly an hour. The oil had gone down a little in the glass. The flame had settled into its final size. That final size was small. It was not meant to fill the room. It was meant to keep the darkness from being complete. There is a difference between a dark room and a room with one small light in it. The difference is not about seeing. It is about knowing you are not the only warm thing present. The flame is warm, the oil is warm, the glass is warm, and the rest of the room is cold and still. But there is a center now, and the center holds. She grew up with that. She grew up with rooms that were mostly dark and partly lit. She grew up with corridors that were dark entirely except where you were standing. She grew up with the particular quiet of a stone building after the last door has closed. That quiet has a quality to it. It is not silence. There is always something. The tick of a clock in the hall, the creak of a floorboard, settling in a room where nobody has walked for hours. The very faint sound of wind, finding a gap somewhere high up in the building and moving through it slowly. These are the sounds a large house makes when it is done for the day. They are not alarming sounds. They are the house breathing. A child who grows up with these sounds does not fear them. She simply knows them. She knows the shape of the staircase in the dark. She knows which floorboard will creak and which will not. That is a kind of knowledge that stays in the body long after the mind has moved on to other things. Years later, decades later, in a different country entirely, she would know the sound of a stone building at night. It does not leave you. It is not the kind of thing that leaves. Consider the garden in those evenings. The garden at Laeken was formal. The paths were gravel. The hedges were clipped into shapes that did not occur in nature, and the flower beds were edged with low borders of box. In winter, all of this went calm. The fountains were drained. The flower beds were bare. The hedges kept their shape, because that is what box hedges do. But they were darker and stiller, and the garden looked like a diagram of itself. She would have seen it from an upper window. Children do look out of windows, especially in winter, especially in the late afternoon when there is nothing else to do and supper is still an hour away. The garden would have been gray and green and brown and still. Nothing moving in it, perhaps a bird far away, crossing from one tree to another. That is the whole view. That is what the window offered. It is not a remarkable view. It is not the kind of thing anyone paints or describes or puts in a letter. But it stays. A winter garden seen from above, in the last light, when you are small and the window is cold against your forehead. That stays for a great many years. There were other children in the palace, brothers. They had their own rooms, their own routines, their own corridors. The palace was large enough that you could go most of a day without seeing another person. The day was quiet. The family was occupied. The servants were in the parts of the building where servants go. It was not loneliness. It is not the same thing as loneliness to be alone in a large building where you know exactly where everyone is. You know they are there. You know the lamps are burning in their rooms. You know that supper will come and you will all be in the same room again. It is simply calm. It is the ordinary calm of a large house in the middle of a long afternoon. That quiet shaped her. It would have shaped anyone. When you grow up in a place like that, you learn a particular relationship with stillness. The corridors are long. The rooms are cold. The lamps come one at a time. You learn that it is not empty. You learn that it has sounds in it. You learn that a room can be dark and still be inhabited because the fire is there, or the clock is there, or your own breathing is there. You do not learn this the way you learn facts. You learn it the way you learn to walk. It goes into the body and it does not come out again. She carried that with her across an ocean. Years later, she carried it into rooms that were completely different in a country that was warm and loud and full of color. And even there, at the end of the day, when the door was closed and the lamp was brought in, the room would have felt familiar. Not because it was the same room. It was not the same room at all. But because the quiet was the same, the quality of it. The way it arrived after the last person left, and the door clicked shut, and the flame settled down. That is what a childhood in a palace gives you. If you are the kind of person who notices, not grandeur, not importance, just a very detailed understanding of what quiet sounds like. She had that. She carried it far. There is one more thing about the evenings in a palace like that, and it is worth saying slowly. At the end of the day, after the last conversation, there was a walk back through the corridors. The corridors were dim. The lamps on the walls had been burning for hours, and the oil was low and the flames were small. Your own shadow moved with you along the stone. It stretched and shortened as you passed each lamp. It was the only thing moving. The air smelled faintly of smoke, not wood smoke, the thin, particular smell of oil burning in a glass. It is a smell that belongs to a certain kind of evening. You would recognize it if you had grown up with it, and you would never quite forget it. At the end of the corridor was a room, your own room. Someone had already been there. The bed was turned down. A lamp was burning on the table, very low. The curtains were closed against the winter. You did not have to do anything. You did not have to prepare anything, or check anything, or close anything down. Everything was already done. Everything was already quiet. That is a particular feeling. It is the feeling of arriving at the end of a day in a house where the care is invisible. Someone had warmed the bed. You did not see them do it. Someone had trimmed the wick. You did not hear it. The room was simply ready. The room was simply still. She would have climbed into that bed and looked at the small flame on the table and listened to the building settle around her. The clock ticking somewhere, the wind far off, the last deep creak of a door in another wing. And then nothing, the quiet taking hold. That was every night. That was hundreds and hundreds of nights, one after another, in the same corridors, past the same lamps, into the same still room. It is not exciting. It is not the sort of thing that fills a chapter in a book. But it is what a childhood is mostly made of, and it lasts. There is another corner of the past that holds the same quiet. There was, perhaps, a gardener at the castle by the sea. We do not know his name. We do not need to. He would have been an older man, or perhaps not old at all, only weathered in the way that people become when they spend their years outside. The castle sat on a rocky point on the eastern coast of a narrow sea. It was white. It looked, from the water, like something that had been set down carefully on the edge of the land and might, on the wrong day, slide gently into the waves. It did not slide. It was built on solid rock, but it had that look about it, a lightness, a feeling of being almost somewhere else. The gardens around it were the real work. They had been planted with great care, trees from warm countries, shrubs that did not belong to that coast at all, but had been brought in from far away and persuaded to grow. The gardener, if he existed, would have known every one of them. He would have known which ones needed covering in winter, which ones wanted shade in summer, which ones had been there longer than he had, and which ones were new and uncertain. A garden like that is never finished. It is not a building. You do not lay the last stone and walk away. A garden is a thing you are always in the middle of, and the middle keeps shifting. In the morning, he would have come down through the lower paths and checked the beds along the seawall. The seawall was low, the water was close. On still days, you could hear it moving against the stones below, not crashing, just moving. A slow, steady sound that did not change much from hour to hour. He would have looked at it. Gardeners look at weather. They look at the sky and the water and the wind, the way other people look at clocks. It tells them what the day will ask. The morning work was the quiet work, pruning, tying back, pulling out what did not belong, moving slowly along a border on your knees with your hands in the soil. The soil there was thin. It sat on top of rock, and it had to be fed constantly, carried in from elsewhere, mixed and laid and fed again. The garden existed because someone kept deciding every season that it should continue to exist. That is true of most gardens. It is true of most quiet things. They persist because someone tends them, not because they are inevitable. By the middle of the day, the work was heavier, watering, carrying, moving pots in and out of the glass houses as the season required. The glass houses were warm. They smelled of earth and damp leaves, and the particular green smell of things growing in enclosed air. He would have gone in and out of them many times a day. The shift from the cool outside to the warm inside and back again. His hands cold, then warm, then cold. It is not a dramatic rhythm. It is not a rhythm anyone writes down. But it is the rhythm of a working day in a garden, and it goes on for years. There is something worth saying about the glass houses themselves. They were built to hold warmth, and they did it simply. Glass and iron, and a stove at one end. The stove was small. It burned wood or coal, depending on what was available and what the season asked. In winter, someone had to tend that stove, not the gardener, usually, a younger man, an apprentice, or a boy from the village whose only job was to keep the fire going through the cold months. He would have come in at night after the doors were closed and sat with the stove for a while, checking the draw, adding fuel, waiting for the heat to settle. The plants around him were quiet. That is a strange thing to say about plants, but it is true. A glass house at night, when the stove is going and the doors are shut, has a quality of stillness that is different from an empty room. The air is alive. It is warm and damp and full of the breathing of growing things. You do not hear them breathe, but you feel the air moving, very slowly, in the way that warm air moves when it has nowhere to go. The boy would have sat with that. He would have known it the way the gardener knew the sound of the bird settling, not as a thought, as a presence. And in the morning, when he opened the door and the cold air rushed in and the warmth rushed out, everything inside would still be there. The leaves would not have moved. The soil would be damp. The pots would still be in their places. Nothing had happened. That was the whole point. Nothing was supposed to happen. The job was to make sure that nothing happened, that the cold did not get in, that the warmth did not get out. That morning found everything exactly where evening had left it. That is a kind of work that does not announce itself. It is invisible when it is done well. You only notice it when it fails. The evening was the best part. The evening was when the garden stopped asking for things and simply sat in whatever state you had left it in. The light changed. On that coast, in that season, the light in the late afternoon came in low across the water and turned everything gold for a short while. The white walls of the castle, the stone paths, the leaves of the trees lit from underneath. It lasted perhaps half an hour. Then it dimmed slowly, and the colors went back to their ordinary selves, and then past their ordinary selves into the softer thing that happens before dark. That softer thing has no name. It is not light and it is not dark. It is the hour when the garden gives up its edges. The hedges stop being precise. The path stops being separate from the beds. Everything blurs gently into everything else, and the shapes you spent the day maintaining disappear. It is not loss, it is rest. The garden is resting. The gardener would have closed the glass houses last. That was the evening task. Walk through them once, check the vents, check the heat, close the doors. The doors were heavy, glass in iron frames. They closed with a particular sound, a deep, soft thud that meant the warmth was sealed in for the night. Then he would have walked back up through the garden toward whatever room was his. The paths were quiet, his own footsteps on gravel, the sea below still moving, making its slow sound against the rock. There were two people living in the castle then, a young couple. They had come there to begin something together, though what exactly they were beginning was not yet clear to either of them. They are not the center of this scene. The gardener is. But he would have seen them some evenings on the upper terrace, standing together, looking out at the water, not doing anything. People on terraces at that hour are almost never doing anything. They are simply standing in the last of the light because it is there and they are there, and there is no reason to go inside yet. The gardener would not have thought much about it. He had seen it before. People standing on terraces, people looking at the sea. It is not a thing that requires interpretation. It is simply what people do in the evening, in a place by the water when the day is done. He would have gone past them quietly. Perhaps they noticed him. Perhaps they did not. It does not matter. The garden was closed for the night. The glass houses were warm. The paths were darkening. Somewhere in the garden, a bird was settling into a tree for the night. You could hear it, adjusting, the small rustle of wings finding the right position on the branch. Then stillness. That is a sound you hear in every garden in the world at that hour. It does not change from century to century. The bird is the same. The tree is the same. The settling is the same. The gardener knew that sound. He heard it every evening. He did not listen to it. He simply heard it, the way you hear your own breathing. And then he went inside, and the garden was alone, and the sea went on moving, and the light went on leaving, and the glass houses held their warmth. Consider how many evenings like that there were. Hundreds, perhaps more. Every one of them exactly the same in shape, and every one of them slightly different in the small details. A different bird, a different quality of wind, a slightly different color in the last light. The gardener, if he kept count, would have lost count long ago. That is what happens with evenings. They are not the kind of thing you count. They simply happen. They simply pile up gently behind you until one day there are a great many of them, and you cannot remember most of them individually, only the feeling of them as a whole. The feeling of walking back through a garden at dusk, the feeling of closing a heavy door, the feeling of gravel under your shoes and salt in the air, and the sound of the water doing what it always does. That feeling stays. It remains in that place on evenings like the ones he knew. The castle is still standing. The gardens are still tended. Someone else does it now. The paths are swept in the same order every morning. The glass houses are opened when the sun warms the air enough, and closed again when it leaves. The sea has not changed its sound. It still moves against the same rocks in the same way, with the same patience it has always had. If you stood on the seawall now, in the evening, and closed your eyes, you would hear exactly what the gardener heard. The water, the wind in the trees he planted, the birds settling. You would not be able to tell what century you were standing in. The evening does not carry a date. The glass houses are still closed every evening by someone. The paths still darken in the same order, from the sea wall inward. The bird settles, the sea still moves. It does not require anyone in particular to keep doing it. It simply goes on. Far from there, and long after, someone else was keeping a small light. Consider now what it meant to cross an ocean in those days. It did not mean what it means now. It did not mean a few hours in a seat with a window. It meant weeks. It meant a great many weeks of the same water in every direction, and the same sky, and the same slow rhythm of a ship moving through both of them. The ship left from a harbor on the coast. The harbor was busy and loud and full of ropes and shouting and the heavy work of loading things into a hold. Then the harbor ended, the coast ended, the noise ended. And what replaced it was a kind of quiet that most people on land never hear. The quiet of open water is not silence. There is always sound. The wood of the hull working against the sea, the creak of the masts, the ropes tightening and loosening as the wind shifts. The water itself, moving along the sides of the ship, always moving, always the same and never exactly the same. But there are no voices in it, There are no doors closing. There are no footsteps on stone, no wheels on a road, no bells calling anyone to anything. It is the sound of the world without people in it, and it goes on for weeks. She was on a ship like that once, crossing from one life to another. Going from the coast she knew to a coast she had never seen. We are not going to follow the reasons. The reasons belong to the daytime, to the awake part of life, to the chapters in the books. We are going to follow the evenings. The evenings on a ship at sea begin earlier than they do on land. There is no horizon full of buildings to hold the light. The sun goes down into the water, and the light leaves quickly, and what comes after it is very large and very dark. A ship at night in open water is a small thing. It is easy to forget that during the day, when the sails are up and the deck is busy and the whole enterprise feels purposeful. At night, you remember. At night, the ship is a small piece of wood on a very large surface of water, and the water does not know it is there and does not care. That is not a frightening thought. It is not the kind of thing that keeps you awake. It is a calm one. It is simply truth of where you are. The watch was set every evening. That was the routine. The day crew went below. The night crew came up. The ship kept moving. The man on watch stood at the front and looked into the dark. There was not much to see. The water, if the moon was up, the stars, if the sky was clear, the faint white line of the bow wave where the ship cut the water, and the water folded away on both sides. He watched for other ships. He watched for land, though land was many days away. He watched for changes in the weather, which announced themselves slowly out here as a thickening of the air, a change in the feel of the wind, a darkening of the horizon in one direction. Mostly, he watched nothing. Mostly, the watch was simply standing in the dark and being awake while other people slept. That is one of the oldest jobs there is. Someone has always had to be awake. On walls, in towers, on the decks of ships, someone standing in the dark, doing nothing, while the world sleeps around them. It is not exciting work. It does not ask anything of the mind. It is not meant to. The best watches are the ones where nothing happens at all. Below decks, the passengers slept. The cabins were small. The beds were narrow. A lamp hung from a hook on the ceiling, and the lamp swung with the ship. That swinging is a strange thing. It never stops. It is very slow. The flame goes left, and the shadows in the cabin rearrange themselves. Then the flame comes back, and the shadows rearrange themselves again. You watch it for a while when you first lie down. You watch the light move across the ceiling and the wall and the ceiling again. Then you stop watching it. Then you stop watching it. Then you sleep, or you try to sleep, and the light goes on moving whether you are watching or not. She would have lain in a cabin like that. She would have watched the lamp swing. The ship was carrying her toward a country she had seen only in pictures and descriptions. A country of mountains and wide valleys, and a kind of light she had never stood in. But that is the daytime story. At night, in the cabin, with the lamp swinging, the country was not real yet. At night, there was only the ship, the wood around her, the water outside the wood, the sound of one against the other. The ship's carpenter slept near the hull. That was tradition on the older ships. The carpenter slept where he could hear the wood, so that if something changed in the sound, a creak that was new, a groan that had not been there before, he would wake. He did not usually wake. There is nothing to hear when things are well. The wood was sound, the ship was well built. But the habit remained. The carpenter near the hull, his ear close to the work, listening, even in sleep, for the thing that might go wrong. That is a kind of care that does not announce itself. You would not know, walking the deck in the morning, that someone had been listening to the bones of the ship all night. You would only know that the ship was still there, still whole, still moving. The days repeated. That is the thing about a long crossing. The days are not different from each other. The sun comes up on the left or on the right, depending on the direction you are sailing. The wind blows, or it does not. The sails are adjusted. The ropes are checked. Someone mops the deck. Someone checks the water barrels. Someone writes a line in the log, and the line says almost exactly what yesterday's line said. Position, wind, sea state, nothing to report. Nothing to report. That is the best line in any log. It means everything is working. It means the calm held. The cook lit his stove in the early morning before anyone was awake. The stove was set into a brick housing on the deck so that if it fell over, it would not set the ship on fire. He boiled water first, always water first. Then he made whatever could be made from what was left in the stores. The stores went slowly down, week by week, tin by tin. The smell of cooking drifted below. That was the morning alarm. Not a bell, not a shout, just the smell of something warm being made in a cold place. By the time the passengers came up, the deck was clean and the sails were set, and the sea was the same sea it had been yesterday. It is a particular thing to wake up and find the world unchanged. On land, something is always different. A new sound, a different light. A door that was open is now closed. At sea, nothing has changed. It is not a place that rearranges itself overnight. The water is there, the sky is there, the ship is still moving in the same direction at the same speed. It is deeply, quietly boring, and boring on a ship is good. The evenings came around again. The watch was set again. The lamp was lit again. The cabin received its swinging light again. And below the hull, the water moved and moved and moved. She crossed in that ship for many weeks. The northern coast disappeared behind her. The southern coast had not yet appeared. In between, there was only this: the wood and the water and the lamp and the watch and the cook and the carpenter and the quiet. It is worth considering how much of any journey is actually the middle. Not the leaving and not the arriving, but the long, still, uneventful middle where nothing changes and the days repeat. Most of any crossing is that middle. Most of any life is that middle. The exciting parts are very short. The middle is where you actually live. She lived in that middle for weeks. You do not notice it passing. The ship carried her. The water carried the ship. The wind carried the water. And at night, the man on watch stood at the front and looked into the dark and saw nothing. And that was exactly right. There is one more thing about the nights at sea, and it is worth saying slowly. On clear nights, the stars came down very close to the water. There were no city lights to wash them out. There was no glow on the horizon from a town. There was only the ship and the water, and above them both a sky so full of stars that it looked heavy. The man on watch would have seen this every clear night. It was not new to him. It was not remarkable after a while. It was simply what the sky looked like when there was nothing else to look at. But for a passenger, coming up on deck for a moment of air before going back to the cabin, it would have been startling. Not in a frightening way, in a calm way. The sky was simply too full. There were too many of them. You could not pick out the shapes you knew because there were thousands of others filling in the gaps. And the gaps themselves were full of a faint light that was more stars. Too far away to see individually, but close enough to glow. She would have stood on that deck some of those nights and looked up. It is not something you can describe to someone who has not seen it. An ocean sky at night with no other light is not a version of the sky you know. It is a different thing entirely. And it does not care that you are looking. It is not performing. It has been doing this for a very long time, over a great deal of water. And it will go on doing it after the ship has passed. And everyone on it has gone wherever they are going. That is the last thing the crossing gives you, if you are paying attention. It is not a lesson. It is not a revelation. It is simply the size of the dark and the age of the light and the smallness of the deck you are standing on. You do not have to do anything with it. You do not have to understand it. You only have to stand there for a little while and then go back below and let the lamp swing and sleep. The crossing ended eventually. They always do. The water changed color. The air changed smell. The horizon, which had been flat and empty for weeks, began to hold the shape of something solid. The new coast appeared slowly. It did not rush forward. It simply thickened, day by day, from a smudge to a line to a thing with color and form. She would have stood on deck and watched it arrive. Everyone does that at the end of a long crossing. You stand and watch the land come to you because you cannot go to it any faster. And watching is all there is to do. The land did not know she was coming. It was simply there, the way it had always been. ages before anyone crossed any ocean. And on the ship, in those last days, the routine held. The cook made breakfast. The watch was set. The carpenter slept near the hull. The log was written. Nothing changed about the ship because the crossing was almost over. The ship did not know it was arriving. The ship only knew the water and the wind and the work of moving through both. The passengers knew. They watched the horizon. They counted the days. But the ship simply sailed the way it had sailed every day since leaving harbor. One more night with the lamp swinging. One more watch in the dark, seeing nothing, keeping the vessel safe. That is how most journeys end. Not with a sudden arrival, but with a slow thickening of the horizon, day by day, and the same routine holding all the way to the dock. The routine is the real crossing. The destination is just where the routine stops. She would have felt the change in the water before she saw the land. The color shifted. The waves shortened. The birds arrived, circling the masts, calling in the particular way that coastal birds call, the way that means the shore is near, even when you cannot see it. The ship slowed. The sails were adjusted. The harbor opened ahead, slowly, a gap in the coastline that widened as the ship turned toward it. Time moved on slowly, as it always does, and somewhere else the lamps were being lit. The city she arrived in was not quiet. It was large and warm and full of people, and it made a great deal of noise from early in the morning until well into the night. But even that city, like every city that has ever existed, had a moment in the evening when the noise began to thin. It did not stop. It never stopped entirely. There were always dogs, and there were always voices somewhere, and there was always the sound of water running in the stone channels that carried it through the streets. But it thinned. The thick, layered noise of the daytime, the carts, the bells, the sellers calling, the horses, the doors, slowly came apart into its separate pieces, and the pieces went quiet one at a time. And what was left was something looser and darker and more spread out. That was the hour when the lamplighters began. They were called faroleros. That is a word worth saying slowly. It comes from the word for lantern, and it means simply the person who tends the lanterns. Every city had them in the age before electric light. Every city in the world that was large enough to have streets and rich enough to light them. The faroleros of that city worked in the evening. They started before the sun was fully gone, because it takes quite a while to light a city, and if you wait until it is dark, you are already late. Each man had a route. The route was always the same. He knew it the way the carpenter on the ship knew the sound of the hull, not as a thought, as a thing in the body. He carried a pole with a small flame at the end of it. The pole was long enough to reach the lamps, which sat on iron brackets on the walls or on wooden posts at the corners of the streets. The lamps were glass and iron. Inside each one was a wick sitting in oil. The oil was heavy and dark, and it smelled like something that had come from the ground a long time ago. He reached up with the pole. He opened the small glass door of the lamp. He touched the flame to the wick. The wick caught. Then he closed the door and moved on. That is the whole job. That is what it looked like. Repeated over and over, street after street, corner after corner, for the length of an evening. It is not a complicated job. It does not require skill exactly. What it requires is patience and the willingness to do the same thing many times without expecting anyone to notice. Nobody noticed the farolero. That is the nature of the work. When it is done well, you do not see the person. You only see the light. You walk down a street and the lamps are burning, and the street is not dark, and you do not think about why. You do not think about the man with the pole who came through an hour ago and touched each one. It is invisible work. It is not the kind of work that earns praise or attention or a place in anyone's memory. It simply keeps the dark from being complete. Consider what a city looks like from above as the lamps come on. We already know what it looks like because we stood on a terrace earlier and looked down at those scattered lights. But consider it from the lamplitter's positions. He does not see the whole. He sees one lamp, then the next, then the next. He is inside the pattern, not above it. He does not know that the city seen from the hill is slowly filling in with light. He does not know that the scattered points are forming a shape, a map of streets drawn in small flames. He only knows that the next lamp is 12 steps ahead, and the door sticks, and the wick needs trimming, and the oil is low. That is the difference between the person doing the work and the person watching the work. The person watching sees the whole. The person doing the work sees the next step. Both are true. Both are real. But the next step is the one that matters, because without it, the whole never forms. The streets of that city were laid out in a grid, mostly. The old center was straight and regular, built on the bones of an even older cities that had been there long before. The farolero would have known every stone of his route. He would have known where the pavement was uneven. He would have known which corner flooded when it rained. He would have known where the dogs slept and where to step around them. He would have known the smell of each block. The block with the bakery smelled of bread. The block with the leather workshop smelled of tanning. The block near the canal smelled of water and mud, and the particular green smell of things growing in still water. These are the things you know about a place when you walk through it every evening at the same hour. You do not learn them on purpose. They simply accumulate the way dust accumulates without effort. The city was warm. That is worth saying again. It was warm in the evening, in a way that the northern coast had never been. The air at dusk had weight to it. It sat on the skin. It carried smells a long way. because warm air holds more than cold air does, and the smells of a city in a warm valley are richer and more complicated than the smells of a city in a cold one. The farolero worked in that warm air. His hands did not get cold the way the lamplighter's hands did in the north. The pole was warm in his grip. The glass of the lamps was warm before the flaming touched them. It is a different experience to do the same job in a warm place. The body is looser. The pace is slower. There is no urgency to get inside because inside and outside are not very different from each other. He would have taken his time. There was no reason not to. On some evenings it rained. The rain in that valley was warm. It came suddenly, without much warning, and it fell hard for a short while, and then it stopped. The farolero kept working in the rain. The lamps had small roofs over them, little hoods of iron, and the flame inside was protected. But the glass got wet, and the door was harder to open, and the pole was slippery, and the whole business took longer. He did not stop. You do not stop for rain when your job is to light a city. The city needs the light. The rain does not change that. After the rain stopped, the streets shone. The wet stones caught the lamplight and sent it sideways, so that each lamp seemed to produce twice as much light as it actually did. That is a small gift the rain gives to a lamplighter. It doubles his work without him doing anything extra. The air, after the rain, smelled of wet stone and wet earth, and the particular sharp sweetness that warm rain leaves behind when it has washed a city. He would have smelled that every time. He would have known it so well that he stopped noticing it. That is what happens with the best things about a place. You stop noticing them. They become the ordinary air. Lamp by lamp, street by street, the small flame at the end of the pole touching each wick and leaving light behind. Behind him, the street was lit. Ahead of him, it was not. That is a strange thing to carry with you through a city. The knowledge that behind you, the world, is brighter than it was, and ahead of you, it is still waiting. He did not think about it that way. Nobody does when they are inside the work. It is only from the outside, or from a great distance in time, that you can see what the work meant. It meant that the city was habitable at night. It meant that people could walk to each other's houses at dark. It meant that a woman coming home late could see the edge of the pavement. It meant that a child looking out of a window could see the street instead of nothing. It meant all of that, and the farolero knew none of it. And that is exactly how it is supposed to work. The good care is invisible. The good light does not draw attention to itself. It simply makes the dark less dark. After the last lamp was lit, the farolero went home. His home was small. His room was a room with a bed and a basin and a candle and a door. He lit his own candle with whatever was left of the flame on the pole. That is a detail that may or may not be true, but it is the kind of thing that would have been true, because it is practical and lamplighters were practical people. Then he ate, then he sat, then the candle burned down, then he slept. And outside, the city glowed with the work he had done, and nobody knew his name, and the streets were not dark. That was every evening. That was years of evenings. The lamps burned all night. By morning, the oil was low, and the wicks were black, and the glass was smudged with soot. Someone came in the morning and cleaned them and filled them and trimmed the wicks. That was a different person. The morning person and the evening person were not the same. The evening person brought the light. The morning person maintained it. Between them, without ever meeting, they kept the city lit. It is one of the smallest partnerships in the history of any city. Two people who never saw each other. Two halves of the same quiet job. The evening one did not know the morning one's face. The morning one did not know the evening one's name. They shared nothing but the root and the lamps and the work. That is enough. That has always been enough. It does not matter that we do not know their names. It does not matter that nobody wrote it down. The light was there. The streets were not dark. The city slept because someone had walked through it first and touched each lamp. That has always been true in every city. It is not the sort of thing that changes. Let us wander somewhere else now. The castle on the hill was not like the palace in the north. It was lighter. The walls were thinner. The windows were larger, and they were open most of the time because the air outside was warm and there was no reason to keep it out. In the north, a building existed to hold the cold at bay. Here, the building existed to let the warm in. That changes everything about how an evening feels. The evenings began with the light leaving the valley. The valley was wide. The mountains on the eastern edge were very tall, and their peaks held snow, even when the air below was warm. As the sun dropped in the west, the shadows of those mountains stretched slowly across the valley floor toward the castle. You could watch this happen. It took a long time. The shadows moved like water filling a shallow basin, slowly and from one direction, and the color of the valley changed as they came. First the far fields went dark, then the near ones, then the edges of the city, then the rooftops, then the trees at the base of the hill. The castle was the last thing the light touched, because it was the highest thing. For a few minutes at the end of the day, the castle was lit and everything else was in shadow, and it looked, from below, like a building floating in the air. Then the light left the castle too, and everything was the same color, and the evening was official. She would have watched this. She watched it many times from the long terrace that ran along the south side of the building. The terrace was stone. The stone was warm. We have said this before about stone in a warm valley, and that has not changed. The stone held the day's heat and gave it back through the evening so that you could stand barefoot on it after dark and feel warmth coming up from below. She may not have stood barefoot. That is not the kind of thing that gets written down about an empress. But the warmth was there, whether she felt it through her shoes or not. The terrace faced south. Below it, the hill dropped away through a forest of old trees, very tall, with gray bark and branches that spread wide and flat. The trees were full of birds. At this hour, the birds were settling. The sound they made was the same sound the bird at the castle by the sea had made. The rustle of wings finding a branch, the small adjustment, then quiet. Except that here there were hundreds of them. The sound was not one bird settling, but many. All at once, a soft, wide rustling that lasted several minutes and then faded into stillness. That is one of the sounds that belongs to this particular place at this particular hour. It has not changed. The trees are there. The birds are there. The settling happens every evening at the same hour in the same way. Inside the castle, the lamps were being lit. The person who lit them was not the farolero from the streets below. This was a different person, a servant of the house, whose job was to walk through the rooms in the late afternoon and bring the light. The routine was the same as in the northern palace, the same taper, the same route, room by room, the same small arrival of warmth and color as each lamp caught. But the lamps here burned a different oil. The smell was different. The color of the light was slightly different. The room it arrived in was different. Lower ceilings, warmer walls, more color in the tiles on the floor. A room in that castle, with the lamp lit and the window open and the warm evening air coming in from the terrace, was a very specific kind of room. It was not cold. It was not sealed. It was not closed against the weather. It was open. It breathed. The curtain moved in the air that came through the window, and the flame of the lamp moved with it, and the shadows on the wall moved with the flame. Everything in the room was gently in motion, all the time, because the air was alive and warm, and it came and went as it pleased. That is a different kind of evening from the ones she had known in the north, where everything was shut tight and still. Here, the stillness was not a sealed thing. It was a breathing thing. The room was quiet, but the quiet had movement in it. She had a writing desk. It sat near the window, where the light was best during the day, and where the evening air reached it first. The desk was not large. It held paper and ink and a pen and a small box for seals and a blotter. She wrote letters. That is what people did in those days. In the evening, when the day's work was done and the light was going, and there was nothing else that required attention. The letters were long. They went to people on the other side of the ocean, and they would take many weeks to arrive, and the replies would take many weeks to come back. That is worth sitting with. The distance between writing a letter and receiving a reply was measured in months, not minutes. You wrote something, you sealed it. You gave it to someone, and then you waited. You waited a great many years. In the waiting, the world kept going. The evenings kept coming. The lamps kept being lit. The birds kept settling. The mountains kept holding their snow. Nothing stopped while you waited. Nothing paused. The letter was somewhere on the ocean, on a ship like the one she had crossed on, and the ship was moving slowly, and the letter sat in a bag in a hold in the dark, and the water moved against the hull, and that was all. She would have sat at the desk and written by lamplight, the pen scratching on the paper, the ink drying slowly in the warm air. The ink dried faster here than in the north. The air was drier. That is a small thing, but it is the kind of thing a person who writes many letters notices. You do not have to blot as carefully. The words set themselves. The page dries as you write. Outside the window, the valley was going dark. The small lights of the city were appearing, one at a time, as the farolero made his way through the streets below. She would have heard the sounds of the evening city rising up from the valley. The dogs, the distant voices, the water in the channels. And closer, the sounds of the castle itself winding down. Doors closing gently, one after another, as the rooms that were not being used were shut for the night. Footsteps in the corridor outside, then no footsteps. The castle was quieter than the city below it. It sat above the noise. The noise reached it, but it reached it thinned out and soft, like music heard from far away through an open window. She would have finished the letter. She would have sealed it. She would have set the pen down and looked out the window at the valley and the lights and the mountains, which were now only shapes against the sky, darker than the dark around them. The volcanoes were there. You could not see the snow anymore. You could only see the shapes, very large, very still, holding their place on the edge of the world. They had been there a very long time. They would be there a great many years after. They did not care about the letter, or the desk, or the lamp, or the woman sitting beside the window. They simply stood. That is what mountains do. They stand, and the centuries go past them, and they do not adjust. There is a comfort in that. It is not a warm comfort. It is a cool one, the comfort of something that does not need you and does not change for you and will be there when everything else has moved on. She would have looked at them for a while. Then she would have turned back to the room. The lamp was burning steadily. The air was warm. The curtain moved. The shadows moved with it. Everything was in its place. The desk, the chair, the sealed letter, the pen set down carefully with a small drop of ink drying on its nib. That is an evening. That is what an evening looked like in that castle, on that hill, in that valley, in those years. It is not dramatic. It is not the sort of evening that gets painted or performed or put in a film. It is simply a woman at a desk by a window, writing to someone far away, in a room with a warm lamp and an open window and mountains that do not move. That happened many times. It happened over and over, evening after evening, for a few years, and then it stopped. It stopped quietly. Most things do. Later, after the letter was sealed and the desk was closed, the castle went through its own quiet ritual of closing down for the night. The servants moved through the rooms one last time. They checked the lamps that needed checking. They closed the windows that needed closing. Not all of them, because the air was warm, but the ones that faced the wind. The kitchen fire was banked. The coals were pushed together under a layer of ash so they would hold heat in the morning. Someone would come before dawn and blow on them, and the fire would come back, and the whole thing would begin again. The corridors went dark, not all at once, one by one, as the lamps in them burned down or were put out. The corridor outside her room would have been the last to go dark, because the servants kept it lit until she was settled. That is a small courtesy that does not get written down, but that someone decided on at some point, and it continued. After her door closed, the corridor went dark too. Then the castle was quiet. The whole building on its hill in the warm dark, with the valley spread out below it, and the mountains standing on the far edge, and the stars coming through in the places where the sky was clear. It is not a ruin tonight. It is not a museum tonight. Tonight it is simply a building where someone lived, and where the lamps were brought in every evening, and where the letters were written, and where the birds settled in the trees. You do not have to remember any of it. It goes on without being remembered. The old records hold a smaller moment that says the same thing. South of the city, past the mountains, the land dropped down into a warmer place. It was not far. A day's journey, perhaps less, but the air changed completely. The valley where the city sat was high and cool at night, but this lower country was warm all the time, even after dark, even in the months when the high valley needed blankets. There was a town there, and in the town there was a garden. The garden was old. It had been planted long before she arrived by someone who loved water and understood what water could do in a warm place. Water ran through the garden in every direction. It was everywhere. Stone channels carried it along the paths. Small fountains sent it upward in low arcs that caught the light. Pools held it still and flat, reflecting the trees above them. The sound of it was constant, not loud, not the roar of a river or the crash of a wave, just the steady, soft sound of water moving through stone. A trickling, a falling, a gentle arriving and departing that never stopped. You do not notice that sound after a while. It becomes the air. It becomes the background against which everything else is heard. The birds sound different over running water. The footsteps sound different. Even the quiet sounds different, because it is not truly quiet. It is quiet with water in it. She came to this garden in the warm months. She came more than once. It was a place to go when the city on the hill felt too high and too formal and too much like a capital. This was not a capital. This was a garden with water in it, in a town where the air smelled of flowers and wet leaves, and the particular sweet heaviness of warm earth after rain. The rain came in the afternoons. It came almost every afternoon. In the warm months, the sky would thicken slowly over the course of an hour or two, and the light would go flat, and then the rain would start. It started gently, a few drops, then more. Then it was everywhere, falling straight down through the warm air, heavy and close and smelling of the sky. The garden drank it. The leaves caught it and held it, and let it run off slowly in long drips. The channels filled, the fountains overflowed quietly into the paths. The pools rose a little, and the reflections in them broke apart and reformed. The rain lasted an hour, sometimes less. Then it stopped. The sky opened. The light came back, different now, washed and clean. And the garden, after the rain, was the most beautiful version of itself. Everything shone. The leaves shone. The stone shone. The water in the channels shone. The wet bark of the trees was dark and rich, and the flowers were brighter than they had been before, as though the rain had rinsed a thin layer of dust from everything and revealed the color underneath. The air was thick with the smell of wet growth. That smell has a name in some languages. It is the smell of the earth breathing out after being given water. She would have walked through that garden after the rain. The paths were wet. The stones were slippery in places. The garden was not formal the way the northern garden had been. The hedges were not clipped into shapes. The beds were not edged with box. The trees were allowed to grow the way they wanted, spreading wide, reaching for the light in their own directions. It was a looser kind of garden, a garden that breathed. There were fruit trees, oranges, perhaps, or limes, or the trees that bear the small sweet fruits that grow only in warm places and have no name in the northern languages she grew up with. The fruit hung on the branches and ripened slowly and fell when it was ready. Nobody rushed it. Nobody needed to. The season was long. There was time. That word again. Time. There was a great deal of it in this garden. The clock moved more slowly here than it did in the city on the hill, or perhaps it moved at the same speed, but there was less to fill it with, and so it felt longer. The evenings in the garden were the longest part. After the rain stopped and the light came back, the sun dropped slowly toward the mountains in the west. The shadows in the garden grew long. The water in the channels turned gold, then copper, then dark. The birds came back. They had gone quiet during the rain, hidden somewhere in the trees, and now they returned, calling to each other in the way that birds do when the rain has ended and the evening is near. She would have sat somewhere in that garden, on a stone bench perhaps, near one of the pools. The bench would have been wet from the rain. She would have sat on it anyway, or a servant would have wiped it first with a cloth. The pool in front of her would have been still. The rain had stirred it up, but it had settled again, and now it reflected the trees and the sky and the first faint stars. The water in the channels ran on. It did not stop for the evening. It did not stop for anything. That is the thing about water in a garden like that. It is always going somewhere. It is always arriving and always leaving and always the same. You cannot step in it twice, as someone said once a very long time ago. But you can listen to it forever and it will always sound the same. She listened. She sat and she listened, and the garden did what it always did, which was nothing at all, but doing nothing in a very beautiful way. The light left slowly. The colors went. The greens became gray. The flowers closed, some of them, the ones that close at night. Other flowers opened. There are flowers that bloom only in the dark, in warm places. They open when the light goes, and they give off a scent that is stronger and sweeter than anything the daytime flowers produce. That scent would have reached her on the bench. It would have come from somewhere in the garden, from a bush or a vine that she could not see in the dark, but that was there, quietly doing the one thing it was made to do. The garden at night was a different place from the garden in the day. It was not less alive. It was differently alive. The sounds changed. The daytime birds were gone, and the nighttime insects had arrived. The insects made a steady, layered sound that filled the air the way the water filled the channels. It was not a single sound. It was many small sounds, all happening at once, all slightly different, combining into a thing that felt like silence, but was not silence at all. She would have sat in that sound for a while. You do not need to identify it. You do not need to know which insect makes which noise. You only need to be in it. The warmth held. That is the important thing about an evening in a place like this. The warmth does not leave when the light does. It stays in the air and in the stone and in the earth and in the water. You are not cold. You are not going to be cold. The night is warm. The bench is warm. The air on your arms is warm. That changes everything about how an evening feels. In the north, the evening was something you retreated from. You went inside. You closed the door. You sat by the fire. Here, the evening was something you sat inside of. You did not need to go anywhere. The garden was the room. The sky was the ceiling. The water was the sound of the clock, marking time in a way that had nothing to do with hours. She had that. She had those evenings in that garden for a little while. It was not a long while. The years there were few, but the evenings in those years were long and warm and full, since the sound of water and insects and the smell of flowers that opened only in the dark. That is not the part of her life that gets told. Nobody writes about an evening in a garden. Nobody makes a painting of a woman sitting on a wet stone bench in the dark, listening to water. But that happened. That was real. That was most of it. The dramatic part was very short. The evenings were long. There was someone who tended this garden at night. There always is. He would have come through after the last visitor had gone. He would have checked the channels. That was the main thing. The channels had to be clear. A leaf could block a channel. A stone, knocked loose by the rain, could slow the flow. A small thing, unnoticed by anyone who was not looking, could change the way the water moved through the whole garden. He would have walked slowly, in the dark, along the edges of the channels, listening. You can hear when a channel is clear. The water sounds even, steady. It does not stutter. When something blocks it, the sound changes. It pools on one side and thins on the other. He would have found the blockage by sound, in the dark, and reached down and cleared it with his hand. A leaf, usually, sometimes a stick, sometimes a handful of silt carried in by the afternoon rain. Then the water ran smoothly again. The sound went back to what it should have been. He moved on. He did this every night. He had done it for years. He would do it for years after, for people he had not yet met, in a garden that would look, from the path, exactly the same. That is the work. The garden stays beautiful because someone walks through it in the dark and listens to the water. It is not the sort of job that anyone remembers. It is not the sort of thing that makes it into a letter. But it is the reason the water sounds the way it sounds. In the morning, when the light comes back and the garden begins again. It is still there. The garden is tended. The water runs on. Consider now a different room in a different country. Consider the letter itself, not what it said, what it was. It was paper and ink, and a fold and a seal and a name written on the outside in careful handwriting. The paper was heavy, not thick, but heavy for its size, the kind of paper that was made to travel. It had to survive weeks of handling, weeks of damp, weeks of being stacked in a bag in a hold in the dark. The ink was black when it went on. Over time, over weeks of travel, it faded slowly. The salt air did something to it. The damp did something to it. By the time the letter arrived on the other side of the ocean, the ink was not quite the color it had been when the pen first touched the page. That is a small thing. Nobody mentions it. But it is true, and it means that the person who received the letter was reading words that looked slightly different from the words that were written. The fold was precise. There was a way to fold a letter in those days. You did not simply bend it in half. You folded it into a shape that protected the writing inside and presented a clean surface on the outside for the address. The address was written in a different hand, sometimes a secretary's hand, because the letter itself was personal, but the outside was practical. Then the seal, a small circle of wax, pressed with a stamp while the wax was still soft. The stamp left an impression, a crest, a symbol, a set of initials, and when the wax hardened, the letter was closed. You could not open it without breaking the seal. That was the point. The seal was a promise that no one had read it between the writing and the reading. It is a gentle kind of trust. You fold the paper, you pour the wax, you press the stamp, and then you give it to someone you do not know, and that person gives it to someone else, and so on, hand to hand, across an ocean. The route was long. The letter left the desk. It went into a bag. The bag went to a rider. The rider went to a port. At the port, the bag went onto a ship. The ship crossed the ocean. We know what that crossing looked like. We spent a night on one already. The letter sat in the hold the entire time, in the dark, in the bag, while the water moved against the hull, and the watch stood at the front, and the lamp in the cabin swung. The letter did not know any of this. It is not a living thing. It does not experience the crossing. But it was there. It was part of the crossing, the same way the cook and the carpenter and the watch were part of it. It traveled the same miles. It heard the same creaking. It was carried by the same wind. On the other side, the bag came off the ship. It went to another rider. The rider went along a road. The road went through countryside, through towns, through places the letter would never see because it was inside the bag. The rider changed horses at the posts. The posts were small stations along the road, spaced a day's ride apart, where a tired horse could be left and a fresh one taken. The rider ate and slept, perhaps for a few hours, in a bed that belonged to the post, and then he went on slowly toward the next one. The letter kept going. It did not eat, it did not sleep. It simply waited inside the bag, inside the dark, to arrive. And one day it did arrive. Someone handed it to the person whose name was on the outside. The seal was checked. The seal was broken. The paper was unfolded. And there were the words, slightly faded, slightly different in color from the day they were written, but there, still legible, still saying what they had been meant to say, weeks ago, in a room on the other side of the world. Consider the distance between the writing and the reading. Weeks, sometimes months. The world kept turning in between. The seasons kept moving. The lamps kept being lit. The gardens kept being tended. The water in the channels kept running. It is not the kind of thing the world waits for. Nothing paused for it. Nothing adjusted. The person who wrote it had already lived several more weeks by the time. The person who read it held it in their hands. Whatever the letter described had already changed. Whatever it asked about had already been answered, or forgotten, or overtaken by something else. A letter from across the ocean was always a message from the past. It arrived describing a world that no longer existed in exactly that form. And the reply, when it was written and folded and sealed and sent back, would arrive in the same way, weeks late, describing a world that had already moved on. This is what communication looked like for most of history, and it is not what we are used to now. It was slow and patient, and accepting of the gap between the writing and the reading. You wrote what you could. You sent it. You waited. You lived your life in the waiting. The waiting is the part that nobody describes, and it is most of the experience. You wake in the morning, and the letter is somewhere on the ocean. You do not know where. You cannot check. There is no way to follow it, no way to know if the ship is moving, or still, or caught in a calm, or held in port by weather. You simply do not know, and you go on with the day. The lamps are lit. The garden is tended. The desk is sat at. The evening comes and goes, and somewhere out there, the letter is moving, or it is not, and you have no way to tell the difference. That is a kind of patience that is very hard to imagine now. It is not a patience you choose. It is a patience that is chosen for you by the distance and the water and the wind. There is something restful about it. If you let it be restful, the letter is gone. You cannot call it back. You cannot speed it up. You cannot add a line you forgot. It is finished. It is on its way. The rest is not your concern. She would have learned that patience early. The first few letters would have been difficult. The waiting would have felt long. The silence on the other end would have felt heavy. But after a while, the rhythm settles. You write, you send, you wait. Another letter arrives from the past describing a world that has already changed. You read it, you reply, you send the reply, you wait again. It becomes ordinary. The extraordinary distance becomes ordinary. That is what humans do with distance. They make it ordinary. They fold it into the routine of days. And after a while, it is simply there, the way the mountains are there, the way the stars are there. A fact of life, not a hardship, just a shape. The writer who carried the letters knew this shape better than anyone. He did not read them. He did not care what was inside. He cared about the road and the horse, and the weight of the bag, and the distance to the next post. The letters were cargo. They were weight. They were a thing to be carried from one place to another. And the carrying was the job. And the job was the same every time. He would have ridden in the early morning before the heat came up. The road was dusty. The horse knew the way. The bag sat behind the saddle, tied down with a strap. Inside the bag, dozens of letters, dozens of folds, dozens of seals, dozens of quiet promises, traveling together in the dark, each one meant for a different person, each one carrying a different set of words. They did not know about each other. They lay together in the bag, the way strangers lie together in a ship's hold, close but separate, each on its own journey inside the larger journey. The writer did not think about this. He thought about the road. And the road went on, slowly, through the morning, through the dust, through the country that the letters would never see. She wrote many letters. She received many letters. The route between the two desks, the one by the window in the warm valley, and the ones on the other side of the ocean, was worn smooth by riders and ships and bags and hands. The letters accumulated. They piled up in boxes. They sat in drawers for years. The ink faded a little more each year. The paper softened slowly over the years. They are still there, some of them, in archives, in collections, in rooms where the air is kept cool and dry so that the paper will last a little longer. Nobody reads them anymore the way they were meant to be read, in the quiet of an evening by lamplight. With the seal freshly broken, they are studied now and handled with gloves. The seal, which was once a promise of privacy, is now a historical detail. But the paper remains heavy. The fold is precise. The ink is there, faded, but there. That is what a letter is. Not the words, the object, the thing that crossed an ocean in the dark, in a bag, on a horse, on a ship, hand to hand, week to week, and arrived. It is a gentle thing. It does not ask anything of you tonight. Time moved on, slowly, as it always does, and somewhere else the crossing was made again. She crossed the ocean again, this time going east. The ship was the same kind of ship. The water was the same water. The wind was the same wind, blowing in the opposite direction now, but still the same wind. It is strange to cross the same ocean twice. The first time you are going towards something. The second time you are going away from it. But the ocean does not know the difference. The ocean does not know which direction the story is moving. It only moves the ship, and the ship moves through the water, and the water closes behind it, and there is no mark left on the surface to show that anything has passed. She would have stood on the deck again. She would have looked at the water again. It is not the same experience the second time. The first crossing was full of the future. Everything ahead was new and unknown and waiting to be seen. The second crossing is full of the past. Everything behind you is known, and you are leaving it. And the distance between you and it grows wider every hour. You watch the horizon behind the ship for a while. You watch the place where the coast was, long after the coast has disappeared. You watch the empty line where the water meets the sky, and you know that somewhere beyond that line is everything you are leaving. Then you stop watching. There is nothing to see. The routine of the ship was the same. The watch was set. The cook lit his stove. The carpenter slept near the hull. The lamp in the cabin swung. The flame went left. The shadows moved. The flame came back. Everything was the same. Everything was completely different. That is what a return crossing feels like. The ship is the same. The sea is the same. The sounds are the same. But the person inside the cabin is not the same person who crossed the first time. She had lived in a warm valley. She had watched the lamps come on from a high terrace. She had sat in a garden where the water ran all night. She had written letters at a desk by a window in the evening, while the mountains held their place on the edge of the world. All of that was behind her now. All of it was on the other side of the water, getting further away with every hour. The cabin was small. The bed was narrow. The lamp swung. We do not need to say what she was thinking. We do not need to follow the mind. The mind is the daytime part of a person, and this is a nighttime story. At night, on the ship, in the cabin, there was only the swinging light and the creaking wood and the sound of the water against the hull. Those sounds do not care what you are thinking. They do not adjust themselves to your mood. They are the same sounds whether you are happy or unhappy, whether you are going towards something or away from it. That is the kindness of a ship at night. It does not ask you to feel anything. It simply moves. The wood creaks. It has always creaked. It creaked on the first crossing, and it creaks now. The sound is so steady that after a few nights, you stop hearing it as a sound and start hearing it as quiet. It becomes part of the quiet, the way the water in the garden channels became part of the quiet. The porthole was small and round. Through it, if the night was clear, you could see a circle of stars turning very slowly as the ship rocked. That circle of stars was the same circle she had seen from the terrace in the warm valley, the same one she had seen from the garden in the north. It is not a comfort she would have asked for. It is not the kind of thing you seek out when the mind is full. But it was there, outside the glass, turning slowly, and it did not require her attention. The blanket on the bed was wool. It smelled of the ship, of salt and damp, and the particular smell of a cabin that has been lived in for weeks. The pillow was thin. The mattress was hard. None of that mattered after a while. A body learns to sleep anywhere if enough nights pass. The ship taught her that on the first crossing, and it taught her again on the second. Sleep on a ship is different from sleep on land. The body never fully settles. It is always adjusting, always compensating for the roll, always making small corrections that happen below the level of thought. You do not rest entirely, but you do sleep, and the sleep is deep in its own way, because the sounds around you are so steady that they become a kind of holding. The watch stood at the front, the same watch, the same job. He looked into the dark and saw nothing, and that was exactly right. His job was the same, whether the passengers behind him were going toward their future or away from their past. He did not know. He did not need to know. He only needed to watch and to stay awake and to keep the ship moving through the night. The stars were the same stars. We have said this already. The same ones that were overhead on the first crossing were overhead on the second. They had not moved. They do not move, or rather, they move so slowly that no human life is long enough to see the difference. That is a strange comfort on a return crossing. The sky does not know you have been away. The sky does not know you came back. It is simply there, the way it has always been, doing what it has always done. The cook made the same food. The supplies went down the same way. The log said the same things. Pazind, sea state, nothing to report. Nothing to report. The same best line, the same quiet holding. The days repeated. The water was the same color. The horizon was the same distance away. And slowly, over the course of many weeks, the water changed. The color shifted. The temperature shifted. The birds changed. There are different birds over different parts of the ocean, and a sailor knows where he is by which birds are following the ship. The northern birds came back, the gulls that belonged to the coast she had left as a young woman. They circled the masts and called in a way that was familiar, in a way that meant the land was near even when you could not yet see it. The coast appeared, the same slow thickening on the horizon, the same smudge becoming a line, becoming a shape with color and form. It was not the same coast she had left from. It was a different harbor in a different country, but it was the same side of the ocean, the northern side, the cold side, the side where the evenings were long and the windows were closed and the fires were lit. She came back to that side, and the ocean closed be her, and the crossing was done. The air was different here. She would have noticed it immediately. The air on the northern side of the ocean was thinner and colder, and it smelled of wet earth and gray skies and the particular chill of a coast where the wind comes off the water without anything warm to soften it. It was the air she had grown up in. It was the air of the corridors and the stone walls and the garden with the fountains shut off for winter. It had not changed. That is the thing about the air of a place. It does not change while you are away. It waits exactly as it was. And when you come back, it meets you at the harbor like something you had forgotten you knew. She knew it. Her body knew it. The cold on the skin, the damp in the lungs, the weight of a sky that sits low over the rooftops. All of it came back. All of it was exactly as she had left it years before, when she boarded a ship going west and watched this coast disappear. The empire ended far away as empires do, and after that, her life became very quiet. We are not going to follow that ending. It is not ours to follow tonight. It belongs to the daytime, to the books, to the people who are awake and want to know how things turned out. What we are going to follow is the quiet that came after. Because that quiet lasted a great many years, much longer than anything that came before it. The years in the warm valley were few. The years in the quiet were many. And the quiet is the part that is almost never told, because there is nothing in it that looks like a story. There are no events. There are no decisions. There are no turning points. There is only a building and a garden and a window and the seasons going past, one after another, for many years. That is where we are going now. That is where most of this life was actually lived. It is not a sad place. It is not a happy place. It is a still place. A place where the world went on turning without asking anything of the person inside it. She had that stillness for many years. More years of stillness than years of anything else. Consider how rare that is. Consider how few lives contain that much uninterrupted quiet. Most lives are full of noise and change and movement right up to the end. Hers was not. Hers went quiet and stayed quiet for decade after decade, while the century changed around her and the world outside the window became something she would not have recognized. But inside the window, inside the building, inside the garden, things changed very slowly. The fire was lit every evening. The lamps were brought in. The curtains were drawn. The clock ticked. And outside the window, the world kept turning the way it always has. It did not need her permission. It did not need anyone's. That is where we are going. There is another corner of the past that holds the same quiet. The building she came to was old. It sat inside a moat. The moat was not wide. It was not deep. It was not there to keep anyone out. It was simply water, running slowly around the base of the walls, reflecting the sky and the trees and the building itself. There were swans on the moat. They moved across the surface in the mornings, very slowly, leaving long lines behind them that widened and faded and disappeared. The swans were always there, year after year. Different swans, probably, over the decades, but always swans, always white, always moving slowly on the water in the same way. She lived in that building for a very long time. We are not going to count the years. The brain that counts does not rest. We are only going to say that it was a long time. Longer than the childhood. Longer than the years in the warm valley. Longer than all the crossings and the letters and the gardens put together. This was most of her life. This was the part that took up the most room. And it was quiet. The building was not large. It was not a palace. It was a castle in the old sense, a stone house inside a moat, with a courtyard and a garden and a few rooms that were used and many rooms that were not. The rooms that were used were warm. The fires were kept going. The curtains were heavy. The floors were stone, covered with rugs that had been there for many years and had faded in the particular way that old rugs fade, failing their brightness but gaining something else, a softness, a depth, a quality of having been walked on by many feet for a long time. She had a room. It faced the garden. The window looked out onto a lawn and a row of trees, and, beyond the trees, the moat and the fields beyond it. The view never changed. That is worth saying. The view from that window was the same every single day for many years. The lawn was green in spring and summer. The trees were full. The moat was dark and still. In autumn, the trees changed color, and the leaves fell slowly, and the lawn was covered with them until someone raked them away. In winter, the trees were bare, and the lawn was white with frost or snow, and the moat sometimes froze at the edges, a thin skin of ice that the swans broke through in the morning with their slow, patient movement. Then spring came again. The leaves came back. The lawn was green again. The moat thawed. The swans moved freely again. That was 1 year. The next year was the same. On rainy days, the moat changed. The raindrops made circles on the surface, thousands of them, overlapping and disappearing, and the reflection of the building broke apart into pieces and reformed and broke apart again. The swans did not mind the rain. They moved through it the same way they moved through the calm. The water ran off their backs. They were made for this. They had always been made for this. She would have watched the rain on the moat. From the window, it is the kind of thing you watch when the day is gray and there is nothing to do, and the fire is burning behind you, and the glass is cold. The rain made a sound on the water. It was not the sharp sound of rain on a roof or on a pavement. It was a softer sound, a hissing, a wide, flat whisper that covered the whole moat at once. That sound is very good for the quiet part of the afternoon. It fills the room without entering it. It stays outside the glass, doing its work, and you are inside the glass, doing nothing. And the arrangement is exactly right. On winter nights, the wind came across the flat fields and met the walls of the building and moved around them. The moat held still beneath the wind. The bare trees bent and straightened and bent again. Inside, none of this reached her. The walls were thick. The fire was lit. The curtains were drawn. The wind was something that happened to the outside of the building, and the inside of the building did not notice. That is what thick walls are for. That is what they have always been for. Not to keep people out, to keep the quiet in. Consider how many times she saw that cycle. The leaves coming and going, the snow falling and melting, the swans breaking the ice and then swimming freely, and then breaking the ice again. It is not a small number. It is the kind of number that stops meaning anything after a while, because the repetition is so complete that each individual year loses its edges and blends into the ones before and after it. That is not a sad thing. It is not a happy thing. It is simply what it looks like when a life becomes very still. The fire was the center of the evening. It was always lit before she came into the room. Someone made sure of that. The fire was ready when she arrived, and the room was warm, and the lamp was burning, and the chair was in its place. The fire in that building was not like the fire in the warm valley. In the warm valley, the fire was a luxury. Here, the fire was a necessity. The winters were long and cold, the way the winters of her childhood had been long and cold. The stone walls held the cold, the way the stone walls of the northern palace had held the cold. The heat from the fire could only reach so far. The rest of the room was cool. But the part near the fire was warm, and that was the part where she sat, and the warmth was enough. The fire crackled. It was the only sound in the room some evenings. The fire and the clock. The clock was in the hallway, but you could hear it from her room. A steady, even ticking that went on all night. It had been ticking before she arrived. It would tick after she was gone. It did not know about her. It simply measured the time, the way a clock does, without opinion. She sat by the fire, and the clock ticked, and the evening went on. There was no schedule to follow. There was no one to meet. There were no letters to write, not anymore. Not in the way she had once written them, to people across an ocean. There was only the room, the fire, the lamp, the clock, the window, dark now, showing nothing but the reflection of the room itself. That reflection is worth considering. A lit room seen from inside at night, reflected in its own window, is a doubled room. The furniture appears again, reversed, floating in the dark glass. The lamp appears again, a second flame, hanging in the nothing outside. She would have seen that reflection every evening. Her own room, repeated in the glass, surrounded by the dark. It is not a complicated image. It is simply what happens when a room is lit and the world outside is not. The glass becomes a mirror. The room becomes two rooms. She sat in one of them. The other one floated in the dark, upside down in the details, silent, unreachable. The servants brought supper. It was simple. It was the same kind of supper every evening, with small variations that followed the seasons. Root vegetables in winter, lighter things in summer, bread always. The bread was baked that morning. There was a kitchen somewhere in the building where someone made bread before dawn, the way someone had always made bread before dawn in every century, in every building that had a kitchen and an oven and a person who knew how to use them. The smell of that bread would have reached her room in the early morning. It would have been the first thing she knew about the day. Before opening her eyes, before the curtains were drawn, before anything. The smell of bread, the same smell that the bakers made in the city in the warm valley, the same smell that the cook on the ship made in the morning, the same smell that had come from the kitchen in the northern palace when she was a child. It does not change. Bread smells like bread in every century and every country. It is one of the constants. It is one of the things that connects every room she ever lived in. After supper, the evening continued in the same way it always continued. The fire burned down. The lamp was trimmed. The clock ticked. At some point, she went to bed. The bed was in the same room or in an adjoining room, and it was made up in the same way every night by the same person or by a person doing the same job. The sheets were linen. They were cool when she got in and warm after a few minutes. The pillow was there. The blanket was there. The lamp was put out or turned very low, and the room went dark, and the fire's glow was the last thing visible, a faint orange warmth on the ceiling, moving slowly as the coals shifted and settled. That glow is worth resting on. It is the same glow that was on the ceiling of the northern palace when she was a child. The same glow that was on the ceiling of on the ship. The same glow that was in every room she had ever slept in where there was a fire. It does not change. The color of fire on a ceiling is the same everywhere. It is the same orange, the same slow movement, the same warmth that comes from light rather than from heat. She fell asleep with that glow. She fell asleep with it every night for many years in the same room, in the same bed, with the same fire, with the same clock ticking in the hall. And in the morning the bread was baking, and the swans were on the moat, and the cycle began again. It is not a story. There is no arc. There is no turning point. There is no moment when everything changes. There is only the repetition, the fire and the bread and the swans and the clock and the seasons going past the window, one after another in the same order for many years. That is what most of this life was, and it is the part that is never told, because there is nothing to tell. But it happened. Every day of it happened. Every fire was lit by someone. Every loaf was baked by someone. Every swan moved across the water, whether anyone watched or not. The building held her. The moat held the building. The fields held the moat. The sky held the fields. And the clock ticked on, measuring time that did not need to be measured, in a room where nothing was going to change. Let us wander somewhere else now. Picture the servants who kept her house at night. There were not many of them. The building was not large enough to need many, but there were always a few. In the hours after she had gone to bed, moving quietly through the corridors, tending to the things that needed tending. The fire was the first thing. A fire left alone will go out. That is the nature of fire. It needs fuel, and it needs air, and it needs someone to arrange both of them in the right way at the right time. There was, perhaps, a woman whose job this was. We do not know her name. We do not need to. She was there in the late evening with a poker and a small shovel and a basket of wood or coal, going from room to room. She would have started with the room where the lady slept. That fire had to last the longest. It had to burn all night, or nearly all night, so that the room would still be warm when the early morning came, and the cold pressed in from the walls and the window. She built it up carefully. Not too much fuel, because too much fuel makes too much heat and too much light, and the sleeper wakes. Not too little, because too little burns out before dawn, and the room goes cold, and the sleeper wakes from that instead. The right amount. The amount that burns slowly and evenly through the hours, dropping from a flame to a glow, to a deep red warmth that sits in the coals and gives off heat without giving off light. That is a skill. It is not a skill that anyone teaches in a school or writes in a book. It is a skill that comes from doing it many times, night after night, and learning by the failures what the right amount looks like. She knew it. She had been doing it for years. Her hands knew the weight of the right amount of coal before her mind had finished deciding. After the sleeping room, the sitting room. That fire could be smaller. Nobody was sitting in it now. But it needed to hold enough warmth that the room would not be completely cold in the morning. Then the corridor. There was a small stove in the corridor, set into an alcove in the wall. It was not meant to heat the corridor. It was meant to keep the chill from reaching the rooms on either side. The woman tended each fire in the same order every night, the same route, the same stops, the same quiet work with the poker and the shovel and the basket. She worked in near darkness. She did not carry a lamp. She did not need one. She did not need one. The fires themselves gave enough light to work by, and her feet knew the corridor, and her hands knew the tools, and the whole business was done by feel. There is something worth saying about working by feel in the dark. Your other senses open up. The sound of the fire tells you what it needs. A fire that is too low makes a thin, uncertain sound. A fire that is too high makes a roaring sound that is not right for a sleeping house. The right fire makes almost no sound at all. Just a steady, quiet ticking of coals settling. She would have listened for that ticking. That was the signal. When the fire ticked, it was ready. She could move on. The smell told her things too. The smell of a fire that is burning clean is different from the smell of a fire that is choking. Clean fire smells like warmth. Choking fire smells like smoke, sharp and wrong. She would have known the difference without thinking about it. The nose knows before the mind does. After the fires, the lamps. The lamps that were still burning needed to be checked. The wick needed trimming. If the wick is too long, it smokes and the glass goes black and the light dims. If the wick is too short, the flame shrinks and flickers and threatens to go out. The right length is a small thing, a few threads of difference. But it is the difference between a lamp that burns cleanly through the night and a lamp that does not. She trimmed them with a small pair of scissors. She carried the scissors in a pocket. They were always in the same pocket. That is the kind of detail that belongs to a job done many times. You do not think about where the scissors are. They are where they always are. The corridor lamp, the hall lamp, the lamp at the top of the stair. Each one checked. Each one trimmed if it needed trimming. Each one left to burn quietly through the remaining hours. Then there was the man on the grounds. Picture him outside, in the dark, walking the path that ran along the moat. He walked it every night. The path was gravel. His footsteps crunched. In winter, the gravel was sometimes frozen, and the crunch was sharper, harder, more like cracking than crunching. He walked slowly. There was no rush. The path went all the way around the building, following the moat, and the walk took perhaps half an hour. And when he was finished, he started again. He was not looking for anything in particular. It is not that kind of watching. He was simply there. His presence was the point. A building with someone walking around it at night is a building that is being watched. He would have heard the moat. The water, when it was not frozen, made a small sound against the banks, a lapping, a quiet arriving and departing of water that had nowhere else to go. He would have heard the wind in the bare trees in winter and the full trees in summer. The sound is different. Bare trees make a clicking, a tapping of branches against each other. Full trees must make a rushing, a moving of leaves that sounds like water, but is not water. He knew both sounds. He had heard them hundreds of times. They were not sounds he listened to. They were simply the sounds of the night in that place, and they were always there. On clear nights, he would have seen the stars above the building, the same stars that were above the northern palace and the warm valley and the ship and the garden by the sea. He did not think about that. It is not the kind of thing you think about when you are walking a gravel path in the cold. He thought about the path, the gravel, the moat, the building, the dark windows. He looked up at the windows sometimes. They were all dark, except one, sometimes, where the lamp was still burning behind the curtain, showing a faint, warm glow through the fabric. That glow meant someone was still awake, or the lamp had been left on for comfort. Either way, it was none of his concern. His concern was the path and the moat and the building and the dark. He walked. The woman inside tended the fires. Between them, without knowing it, they kept the night going. That is the partnership again. The same partnership as the lamplighters in the city. Two people doing two halves of the same quiet work, one inside and one outside, never meeting in the course of it. The inside work was warmth. The outside work was watching. Together, they made the night safe and warm and still. It is not a dramatic thing. It is not the kind of thing that gets remembered or written down or put in a painting. It is not a thing anyone asked for. It is simply what happened every night in that building for a great many years. The fires were tended. The lamps were trimmed. The path was walked. The moat held still. And inside, in the warm room, in the bed, with the glow of the fire on the ceiling, the person they were all caring for slept. She did not know they were there. You do not need to know. That is not how care works. That is how the best care works. It is invisible to the person receiving it. It is simply the reason the room is warm and the lamp is steady and the building feels held. She slept, they worked, the night went on. There is one more thing about the man on the path, and it is worth saying. At the end of his last walk, when the sky in the east was beginning to show the first thin line of gray, he would have stopped by the moat one final time. The water was still. The building was still. The windows were all dark now because the lamp behind the curtain had finally gone out or been turned down to nothing. He would have stood there for a moment, not thinking, not waiting for anything, just standing in the last of the dark before the morning took over. The air at that hour is the coldest it will be all night. The ground has given up the last of its warmth. The stone is cold. The gravel is cold. The air has a clarity to it that it does not have at any other hour. You can see further in that air. The fields beyond the moat are visible, stretching out flat and gray toward the horizon. The trees are visible as shapes. The sky is visible as a thing that is about to change. He would have known that change was coming. He had seen it many times. The gray line in the east would thicken and brighten and turn pale, and the stars would fade, and the shapes would sharpen, and eventually the first light would reach the walls of the building and the moat and the path he was standing on. He would not wait for that. His job was the night. The morning belonged to someone else. He went inside. The woman who tended the fires was already up again, or perhaps she had never gone to bed. She was starting the morning fires now, building them back up from the coals she had carefully left the night before. The coals were still warm. That was the proof of her work. The proof that she had measured the fuel correctly, that she had given the fire exactly what it needed and no more, and that the fire had done what she asked it to do. She blew on them gently. The coals brightened. She added fuel, slowly, a little at a time, and the fire came back. It is the same fire. It is always the same fire, in a sense. It goes down at night, and it comes back in the morning, and the person who brings it back is the same person who put it to sleep. That is a cycle as old as fire itself. Someone banks the coals. Someone blows on them in the morning. The fire has never truly gone out. It has only been resting. The bread was already baking. The smell came down the corridor. The building was waking up. And outside, the swans were moving on the moat, slowly, breaking the thin ice if there was ice, gliding through clear water if there was not. A new day, exactly like the one before, exactly like the one after. It went on for many years. Night after night after night, for more nights than anyone counted. The old records hold a smaller moment that says the same thing. There was a clock in the hallway that had to be wound once a week. It was tall. It stood against the wall in a wooden case with a glass door, and behind the glass the pendulum moved, back and forth, with a patience that did not belong to any living thing. Someone wound it. That was a job, a small job, done once a week, on the same day, at roughly the same hour. The person who did it opened the glass door and reached inside and turned a key. The key was brass. It was heavy for its size. It turned slowly with a clicking sound, each click tightening the spring inside the mechanism a small amount. When the spring was fully wound, the key would not turn anymore. You could feel it. The resistance was gentle but firm. It said, "That is enough." Then you closed the glass door and walked away, and the clock went on doing what it had been doing before, measuring time, tick by tick, hour by hour. It is not obvious what the clock was measuring. In most buildings, a clock measures the time between things. The time between breakfast and lunch. The time between a meeting and the next meeting. The time between now and the thing that is going to happen. In this building, there was nothing going to happen. The next thing was the same as the last thing. The fire would be lit. The bread would be baked. The swans would move on the moat. The seasons would pass. It does not matter that nothing was changing. The clock measured all of this faithfully. It did not know that nothing was changing. It did not know that the time it was counting was empty of events. It simply counted because that is what clocks do. There is something restful about a clock that is counting nothing. It goes on doing its job. It is ticking. It is marking the hours and the half hours with a small chime that rang through the corridor and reached the rooms on either side. But the hours it is marking are not urgent. They are not leading anywhere. They are simply passing, the way clouds pass, the way water moves in the moat, the way the light crosses the floor of a room from one side to the other over the course of an afternoon. The clock did not care. It does not distinguish between busy time and empty time. That is the great virtue of a clock. It does its work without opinion. She heard it every day. Every hour, the chime. Every half hour, a smaller chime. Every tick, the sound of the pendulum moving from one side to the other and back. It would have become invisible to her, the way the water in the garden channels became invisible to the person sitting by the pool. You hear it without hearing it. It is simply there. Consider the seasons passing through that window. The window we described before, the one that looked out onto the lawn and the trees and the moat and the fields. The same window, the same view, year after year. The first green of spring is always a shock, even when you have seen it many times. The trees go from bare to budding to fully green in the space of a few weeks. And the change is so complete that it feels sudden, even though it is not sudden at all. She saw that change many times. She saw the first green arrive and spread and deepen into the full green of summer, and she saw the full green hold for months, and she saw it begin to turn. The turning is slower than the greening. The leaves go from green to yellow to copper to brown over the course of many weeks, and for a while the tree holds all of those colors at once, a mixture that does not look like anything anyone would choose, but that is, in its way, beautiful. Then the leaves fall. They fall slowly, one or two at a time at first, and then in larger numbers, and then all at once when the wind comes and the tree is bare and the lawn is covered and someone rakes them away. The raking is a sound that belongs to autumn the way the bird settling belongs to evening. The scratch of the rake on the grass, the slow gathering of leaves into piles, the quiet work of clearing a surface so that the next thing can happen on it. The next thing is winter, snow sometimes, frost often, the gray sky that sits low and does not move for weeks. She knew that sky. She had known it since childhood. It had not changed. The sky above this part of the world is the same gray in winter that it was when she was small, looking out of the window of the northern palace at the garden with the fountains shut off. it is the same sky. It has always been the same sky. And then spring again, the green again, the shock again, expected and still somehow new. How many times? That is not a question we need to answer, and it is the question we are going to leave unanswered, because the brain that counts does not rest. Many times, that is enough. She saw it many times. The clock was wound every week through all of those seasons. The same key, the same clicking, the same gentle resistance at the end. The person who wound it changed over the years. Different hands turned the same key. But the clock did not notice. The clock does not know whose hand is on the key. It only knows that the spring is tight and the pendulum can go on. It is there, that clock, or one very like it, in a hallway, in a building, behind a glass door, ticking, being wounded by someone once a week on the same day. The pendulum moves, the chime rings, the hours pass. You do not need to count them. They do not need to be remembered. They only need to pass, and they do, with the same patience they have always had. Far from there, and long after, someone else was keeping a small light. The world did not stop while she was in that building. It went on doing what it has always done. It turned. The seasons passed slowly. The cities grew. The lamps changed. The roads changed. The ships changed. The letters changed. The lamps in the city, in the warm valley, are electric now. They come on all at once, at a set hour, without anyone walking through the streets with a pole and a flame. There is no farolero. It does not work that way anymore. There has not been one for a very long time. The job ended quietly, the way most jobs end. It is not the kind of thing that gets announced. It was a slow replacement. One year there were fewer of them. The next year, fewer still. And then, one evening, the last one did not come, and the electric lights came on instead, and nobody noticed the difference. The streets are still lit. That is the thing that did not change. The method changed slowly. The technology changed. The person disappeared. But the streets are not dark. Someone, somewhere, in an office or a power station, is still doing the work of keeping the city lit at night. The work is the same. The hands are different. The gardens at the cafes by the sea are tended to this day. Someone walks through them in the evening and closes the glass houses and checks the paths. The glass houses remain warm inside. The trees that were brought from far away are there, or their descendants are, grown from seeds or cuttings taken from the originals and planted in the same soil. The sea moves against the rocks below the garden wall. It makes the same sound it made when the gardener walked past it every evening. The sound has not changed. The water does not know that the gardener is gone. It does not keep track. The bird settles. A different bird, certainly. Many generations of birds by now. But the settling is the same. The small rustle of wings on a branch at dusk, the adjustment, the stillness that has not changed in any garden in any century. The castle on the hill in the warm valley is a museum now. People walk through the rooms during the day and look at the furniture and the paintings and the view from the terrace. The terrace remains. The stone is warm in the evening. The valley spreads out below, and the mountains stand on the eastern edge, and the snow remains on the peaks. The volcanoes have not moved. They stand where they have always stood, in the same patient way. In the same patient way, holding their place on the edge of the world. They do not know that the building behind them is a museum now. They do not care that the person who watched them is gone. They simply stand. That is what they have always done. The garden in the warm town to the south runs with water. The channels remain. The stone is wet. The fountains send water upward in low arcs that catch the light. Someone tends that garden at night. Someone walks along the channels in the dark and listens for the sound of a blockage and reaches down and clears it with their hand. The water runs smoothly in the morning. The flowers that bloom at night go on blooming. The insects make their layered sound in the warm air. It does not require her to be there. It does not require anyone in particular. It simply goes on because gardens go on and water goes on and the work of tending things at night goes on. There is a woman tonight, somewhere in the world, banking a fire in a stone building so that the room will be warm in the morning. She does not know about the woman who did the same thing in the building inside the moat decades ago. She does not know about the boy who kept the stove going in the glass houses by the sea. She does not know about any of them. But the work is the same. The gesture is the same. The poker in the hand, the coals pushed together, the ash laid over the top to hold the heat. The same small calculation, enough fuel to last, not so much that the room overheats. That calculation has been made every night for as long as there have been fires and buildings and people sleeping in them. It was made in the northern palace. It was made in the castle on the hill. It was made in the building inside the moat. It is being made tonight. The person making it does not think of herself as part of a long line. She thinks of herself as someone tending a fire. That is enough. That is all it has ever been. And somewhere else, tonight, a man is walking a path in the dark around a building. A different building. A different path, but the walk is the same. The gravel under the feet is the same. The sound of the wind in the trees is the same. He is not thinking about the man who walked the path around the moat. He does not know that man existed. He is thinking about the path and the cold and the hour and the end of his shift. That is the nature of this kind of work. It does not carry a history. It does not remember itself. It simply happens every night, performed by someone new, in the same way, for the same reason. The reason is always the same. Someone is sleeping, and the night needs to be kept. That has always been true. It was true in the old city with the faroleros. It was true on the ship with the watch. It was true in the building inside the moat with the woman and the fires and the man and the path. It is true tonight. Someone right now is keeping the night. You do not know their name. You do not need to. The building inside the moat stands. The moat is there. The swans are there, or new ones are, white and slow and patient on the water. The clock in the hallway is there, or one very like it, ticking, being wound, measuring time that does not need to be measured in a building where nothing is going to change. The fields around it are flat. The sky above it is gray in winter and blue in summer. The trees go through their cycle, the greening and the turning and the falling, and the bare branches and the greening again. She is not there anymore. She has not been there for many years. But the building does not know that. The building holds the same rooms in the same arrangement with the same windows looking out at the same view. The fire can be lit in the same fireplace. The lamp can be placed on the same table. The corridor is the same length. The floorboard that creaked goes on creaking. The staircase has the same shape in the dark. These things last longer than people. Buildings and gardens and moats and clocks and paths and channels and glass houses. They outlast the people who lived in them and tended them and walked through them. That is not a sad thing. It is not a happy thing. It is simply the way things are. The world is made of things that last and people who do not, and the things that last go on, holding the shape of the people who are gone. A room that someone lived in for many years holds the shape of that life, not visibly, not in a way you could measure, but in the worn place on the floor where the chair always stood, in the particular angle of the light from the window at the hour when someone always sat there, in the height of the mantelpiece and the distance from the bed to the door. These are the small impressions a life leaves on a building. They are not dramatic. They are not monuments. They are simply the record of someone having been there for a long time, doing the same things in the same order, day after day. She left that record. It remains. The building holds it the way. The building holds the warmth of the fire, invisibly, slowly releasing it, long after the fire itself has slowly gone out. And the stars are there. The same ones, the same handful of bright ones that were above the northern coast and above the warm valley and above the ship and above the moat. They have not moved. They will not move. They are doing what they have always done, which is nothing at all, which is more than enough. Consider that for a moment. The same lights that were overhead when she was a child, looking out of a palace window, are overhead right now, over your roof, whatever hour it is where you are. They do not know about her. They do not know about you. It is not the kind of light that knows. They do not know about any of the people who have ever looked up at them from terraces and gardens and ship decks and windows. They are simply there. It is not a performance. They have been there for many years. They will be there for a great many years after. There is a harbor tonight where a ship is tied up and a lamp is burning on the mast. There is a kitchen tonight where someone is measuring flour in the dark because the bread has to be ready before dawn, and it always has. There is a garden tonight where the glass houses are closed and the heat is holding, and the trees from far away are breathing in the warm, damp air. There is a corridor tonight in an old building where a clock is ticking in its wooden case and nobody is listening, and the pendulum is moving back and forth with the same patience it has had for 100 years. There is a path tonight around a building where someone is walking in the dark, crunching on gravel, checking the edges of things, making sure that nothing has gone wrong while everyone else was sleeping. There is a child tonight looking out of a window at a garden in the last of the afternoon, watching a small flame move along a path, stopping at each lamp, leaving a glow behind. These things are not connected. The people doing them do not know about each other. They have never met. They have no reason to meet. But the work is the same. The care is the same. The holding together of the night is the same. In every century, in every building, on every coast. Someone has always been keeping watch. Someone is keeping watch tonight. You are not required to join them. You are not required to do anything at all. That is the last thing this night has to say. The world has been turning for a very long time. The lamps have been lit in one form or another every evening in every city by someone. The gardens have been tended. The fires have been kept. The bread has been baked before dawn. The clocks have been wound. The paths have been walked. The water has been running through the channels all night. None of it required her. None of it requires you. It simply goes on. It has always gone on. Tonight, it can go on without you. You do not need to remember anything you heard tonight. There will be no questions in the morning. If one small room of the past stayed with you, let that be enough. And if nothing stayed, that is fine too. The past does not mind being forgotten. It goes on quietly either way. If you are still with us, thank you for staying. If you have already drifted off, thank you for that too. The world has been turning for many years. Tonight, it can turn without you. You are allowed to rest. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive.